Imagine this. You're lying in bed, the house utterly silent, steeped in the kind of darkness that presses in on your eyelids. You feel a chill, not just the room's temperature, but something deeper, colder, brushing against your skin. You pull your blanket tighter. And then, slowly, deliberately, you feel it being tugged away from your chin. Not a sudden rip, but a creeping, insistent pull, inch by agonizing inch, until your chest is exposed to the frigid air, and the darkness feels suddenly present. It's unsettling, isn't it? A common enough detail in ghost stories, perhaps. But what if I told you that the force doing the pulling wasn't a disembodied spirit tied to the land or the house? What if the haunting wasn't about the place at all, but about the person sleeping in that bed? This isn't about the friendly ghost in the attic or the lingering specter of a past tragedy. This is about something far more intimate, far more volatile, and infinitely more terrifying. It's about the poltergeist. By the end of our time together tonight, you'll understand why these cases challenge everything we think we know about the afterlife. You'll see why the line between victim and perpetrator blurs, and why the source of true terror might not be outside your door, but simmering just beneath your own skin. Let's go back to the summer of 1978, a sleepy, unassuming suburb in Ohio. Picture the kind of street where every house looks much like the next. Neat lawns, two-car garages, children's bikes left carelessly on driveways. A picture of perfect, mundane American life. This is where we find the Miller family. Robert and Susan, solid, hard-working parents, trying to navigate the choppy waters of raising two teenagers, 16-year-old Mark and his younger sister, 14-year-old Emily. They were, by all accounts, a perfectly normal family, facing normal teenage dramas. Nothing about their lives suggested they were about to become unwilling participants in one of the most chilling paranormal events of the decade. The initial signs were so subtle, so easily dismissed they barely registered. A misplaced set of car keys, found later in an impossible spot, tucked inside a sugar bowl. A book that had been on the nightstand, now lying open on the floor across the room. Small things, annoying certainly, but chalked up to forgetfulness, or perhaps just the general chaos of a busy household. But then the pattern began to emerge. These odd occurrences seemed to happen more frequently, almost exclusively, when Emily was either home or had just left a room. It started with the quiet things, a persistent, unexplainable cold spot that followed her from the kitchen to her bedroom, even on the hottest summer days. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant transformer that only she seemed to hear, buzzing faintly in the corners of the house. Her parents naturally were skeptical. Teenagers are often dramatic, prone to exaggeration. Emily was no different. But the cold spots became undeniable, palpable pockets of frigid air that made even her skeptical father shiver. The low hum grew louder, sometimes accompanied by a faint crackling sound like static electricity. They tried to rationalize it. Drafts, old wiring, overactive imagination. But the events began to escalate in ways that defied logical explanation. Why this house? This family? What made them different? Or rather, what made Emily different? That was the first unsettling question. The small, annoying incidents quickly gave way to outright impossible ones. One evening, Susan Miller was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Emily was upstairs in her room listening to music.
Suddenly, a ceramic plate sitting innocently on the counter lifted slightly, trembled, and then slid off the edge, smashing to pieces on the linoleum floor. Susan froze. No earthquake, no bump, just a plate deciding, apparently, to commit suicide. A few days later, Robert was reading the newspaper in the living room when the large, heavy wooden rocking chair in the corner began to rock gently, on its own, empty. Then faster, faster still. He stared, utterly bewildered, as it thrashed violently for a full 30 seconds before abruptly stopping. These weren't subtle hints anymore. These were direct challenges to the natural order of things. The family started to feel a pervasive sense of unease, a tightening in their chests that had nothing to do with deadlines or school tests. The air in the house itself seemed to thicken, charged with an invisible tension. The smell of dust, disturbed from long dormant places, became a frequent, cloying scent. They heard whispers now, faint and indistinct, like a radio tuned between stations, fluttering just at the edge of hearing. Usually from Emily's room when she wasn't there, or from the living room when everyone was asleep. They weren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur that hinted at presence, at observation. The initial disbelief gave way to fear, then to a kind of desperate, silent terror. They tried to talk about it, but the words felt inadequate, almost ridiculous. How do you explain to your neighbors that your kitchen utensils are flying across the room, that your daughter's bed sometimes shakes violently, even when she's not in it? This wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It didn't feel like the lingering spirit of a past resident, mourning or seeking revenge. These incidents felt directed, almost temperamental, like a child throwing a tantrum, but a tantrum with invisible, destructive force behind it. The energy felt raw, untamed, and deeply personal. It felt tied to Emily. Desperate, the Millers eventually reached out. Not to a priest, not at first. They contacted a local parapsychologist, Dr. Elias Thorne, known for his methodical approach and his interest in what he called anomalous energetic manifestations. He arrived with a small team, carrying strange equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, thermometers, sound recorders, and a battery of cameras. Dr. Thorne's initial focus wasn't just on the house. He spent an equal amount of time observing the family, particularly Emily. He noted her quietness, her frequent outbursts of frustration over trivial matters, her withdrawn nature. He also noted the subtle shifts in temperature around her, even when she was perfectly still. Her eyes, often bloodshot from lack of sleep, held a haunted quality. It's a common thread in poltergeist cases, you see. They don't typically center around ancient burial grounds or haunted manor houses. They cluster around people, often adolescents, particularly young women, going through periods of emotional turmoil, stress, or psychological change. Why? Is there a link to nascent psychic energy, a raw, uncontrolled power bubbling up, or something far darker, something external that feeds on that turbulent energy? This is where the story truly deviates from your standard ghost tale. Are you still with me? Because this is where the implications become deeply unsettling. Dr. Thorne's team meticulously documented everything. Their sensitive microphones often picked up a chilling, sub-audible hum, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house, too low for human ears, but undeniably present on their recordings.
They charted temperature drops of 15, sometimes 20 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds, pockets of frigid air that would suddenly materialize, chilling them to the bone, even as the rest of the room remained stiflingly warm. Motion-activated cameras, strategically placed throughout the house, captured undeniable evidence. A vase sliding off a shelf with no visible impetus, a framed photo on a dresser slowly, deliberately turning itself face down, as if in a gesture of dismissal or contempt. Emily's behavior became more erratic. The pinpricks weren't just a sensation. She would sometimes frantically rub her arms, convinced tiny, invisible needles were piercing her skin. She would wake up screaming, reporting vivid nightmares of being suffocated or dragged. Her nightmares weren't vague, they were visceral, full of the sensation of being held down, of cold hands pressing against her face, of a suffocating weight that left her gasping for air even after waking. Yet, at times, she would seem almost detached from the chaos, observing a flying object with a strange, almost vacant curiosity. Or, even more disturbingly, a flicker of something akin to a smirk. It was fleeting, a shadow of an expression, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't defiance, but something colder, almost as if an alien consciousness momentarily surfaced, relishing the chaos before Emily's own terror reasserted itself, a quiet observer in her own personal hell. The air in the house now felt heavy, almost breathable with the weight of unseen forces. The scent of ozone, like after a lightning strike, became noticeable before some of the more violent outbreaks, a sharp, metallic tang that stung the nostrils. The low murmur of the investigators' voices, their scientific jargon, seemed utterly inadequate against the growing, palpable dread. The phenomena, once merely disruptive, took a sharp, terrifying turn towards the malevolent. It began with physical contact. Mark, Emily's older brother, was the first to experience it. He was walking down the hallway, humming to himself, when he felt a sudden, brutal shove from behind. Not a clumsy bump, but a deliberate, forceful impact that sent him stumbling forward, hands flailing, almost crashing into the wall. He spun around, heart pounding, expecting to confront a prankster. But the hallway was utterly empty, the air still and silent. A few days later, his arm bore a deep, angry red scratch, 3 distinct lines, as if raked by clawed fingers, that no one could explain and that took weeks to fade. Then it was Emily. Her skin, once clear, became a canvas of inexplicable torment. She began to wake with fresh, mottled bruises on her arms and legs, dark, angry circular marks, or long, thin welts that crisscrossed her skin, appearing overnight with no memory of impact. She swore something was pinching her flesh, slapping her face with unseen force, even yanking her hair with agonizing tugs while she slept, leaving her whimpering. Her parents, horrified and desperate, started sleeping in her room, taking turns on an old air mattress, their eyes scanning the darkness, listening for any sound of a human intruder. The silence of the night was only broken by Emily's terrified gasps and the creaking of the old house. There was never an intruder, only the unseen. Here's what we know so far. The Miller family, an ordinary suburban unit, found themselves in the grip of increasingly violent and inexplicable phenomena. The incidents, ranging from moved objects to physical assaults, were undeniably centered around their 14-year-old daughter, Emily. They defied typical ghost explanations, appearing to be reactive, spontaneous, and deeply personal. Dr. Thorne and his team were bewildered.
The EM field spikes were off the charts, but correlated directly with Emily's emotional state. When she was upset, angry, or particularly stressed, the activity intensified dramatically, causing their sensitive equipment to shriek with alarm. Was the entity feeding on her emotions, drawing strength from her turmoil? Or was Emily, unknowingly, creating the entity herself, a terrifying manifestation of her own internal chaos? This was the horrifying question that began to gnaw at them. One evening, Susan Miller was reading aloud to Emily, trying to calm her. The room was quiet, save for Susan's gentle voice and the rustle of pages. Suddenly, a vase from Emily's dresser flew across the room with shocking force, a ceramic missile, narrowly missing Susan's head before shattering against the wall in an explosion of shards. A moment later, as the echoes of the crash died, a chilling, guttural whisper seemed to emanate not from the air, but from Emily's own mouth, though her lips weren't moving, her eyes wide with terror. The whisper was indistinct, a low, rasping sound, but the tone was undeniably hostile, filled with a raw, ancient malice that seemed to leach the warmth from the air. It wasn't Emily's voice. It was deeper, coarser, ancient. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The air grew impossibly heavy, the temperature plummeted, and the room felt as if it were suffocating them, pressing in from all sides. That night marked the beginning of the true peak horror. The incidents became less about objects and more about psychological torment and direct assault. Emily's bed would shake so violently the springs groaned with metallic agony, the wooden frame slamming against the wall with rhythmic, bone-jarring force, yet no one could touch it or stop it. Her possessions, once innocent childhood treasures, would rearrange themselves into grotesque, unsettling patterns. Her dolls, once lined neatly, now faced the wall in a silent, accusatory semicircle, their small, plastic eyes seeming to watch with malevolent intent. Her clothes would be found inexplicably shredded, her beloved books torn apart as if by an unseen, furious hand, their pages scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. One night, the entity seemed to take a more direct, chilling form. Emily was asleep, or trying to be, while her father sat vigil in the armchair across the room, exhaustion etched on his face. He swore he saw a disturbance in the air above her bed, not a solid form, but a chilling, shimmering heat haze effect, like looking through distorted glass, that slowly began to coalesce into a vague humanoid outline. It wasn't a spectral figure, it was a profound absence of light, a shifting, malevolent shadow that seemed to drink in the ambient glow of the small nightlight in the corner, making the surrounding darkness even deeper, more absolute. A cold so intense it burned radiated from it, making the hairs on Robert's arms stand on end. Robert, frozen in absolute terror, watched, paralyzed by an invisible force, as this dark, suffocating form slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to descend towards his daughter's sleeping figure. He couldn't move a muscle, couldn't scream, couldn't even draw a proper breath. He could only feel the icy tendrils of dread gripping his heart, squeezing it tight. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick and viscous, like being submerged in freezing water, pressing in on his chest. The pressure in the room was immense, almost physically painful, making his eardrums throb.
Then a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to claw its way up from the very bowels of the earth, vibrated through the room, rattling the window panes in their frames.
It wasn't loud, but it was deep, ancient, and filled with such raw, primal malevolence that Robert felt his sanity fraying at the edges, a thin thread about to snap. Emily stirred, whimpering, her eyes still closed, but her face contorted in a silent scream, a shadow of pain crossing her features. The dark shape seemed to press down on her, the sheets indenting as if under immense, invisible weight. He lunged forward, finally breaking free of his paralysis, screaming her name, a primal sound torn from his throat. As he reached the bed, the shape dissipated instantly, dissolving like smoke, leaving behind an unbearable, bone-aching cold and the lingering, acrid smell of burnt hair and sulfur. Emily jolted awake, gasping for breath, her skin clammy and cold, her eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. She was covered in new bruises, dark and fresh, and a single thin line of blood trickled from her nose, stark against her pale face. If it's not a ghost, and it's not simply psychic energy as we understand it, then what is it? An unconscious projection of trauma, manifesting with physical force, or something far more sinister that uses that trauma as a conduit? That moment, that physical assault by an unseen, malicious entity etched itself onto the very fabric of the Miller family's being. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a siege. Just as suddenly and as inexplicably as it began, the activity in the Miller home stopped. It wasn't a gradual tapering off. One morning, Emily woke up and the house was simply quiet. The cold spots were gone, the hum had vanished, no more flying objects, no more whispers, no more bruises. The entity, whatever it was, simply ceased its torment. The cessation of activity often correlates with a significant change in the focal person's life. In Emily's case, it coincided with her finally receiving therapy, beginning to process some deep-seated anxieties and traumas she had been repressing. The family also decided, after months of terror, that Emily would spend the summer with her aunt, a considerable distance away. When she left, the phenomena left with her. The house itself returned to its suburban normalcy, superficially at least. The cracks in the plaster from thrown objects were repaired, the broken dishes replaced, but the silence that settled over the home was not one of peace, but of a lingering, hollowed-out absence. The faint residual scent of fear seemed to cling to the wallpaper. The Miller family, however, was changed forever. The easy camaraderie, the sense of security, the very fabric of their family unit had been stretched and torn by the ordeal. Robert never quite looked at his daughter the same way again, always with a subtle flicker of apprehension in his eyes. Susan became perpetually jumpy, flinching at sudden noises. And Emily carried a deep, unspoken trauma, a quiet fear that perhaps, somewhere deep inside her, the potential for that destructive force still resided. The parapsychologists, Dr. Thorne included, left with mountains of data, but no definitive answers. They had documented the impossible, observed the undeniable, but the why remained elusive. Was it Emily's own unconscious mind, twisting reality through a latent, powerful psychokinetic ability brought on by stress? Or was it an unknown entity, drawn to her emotional vulnerability, using her as a conduit, a battery for its terrifying manifestations? If these events are truly tied to human psychology, does that make them less real, or more terrifying because they originate from within us? The very thought is a profound violation of our understanding of self. The hollow quiet of the house after the chaos, the feeling of absence, was not a comfort, but a reminder of the sheer, raw power that had been unleashed. Poltergeists. The name itself, noisy ghost in German, is misleading, because as we've explored with the Miller family, these cases defy the traditional ghost narrative. They aren't the residual imprint of a past life or the mournful spirit of a departed soul. Poltergeists are active, they are reactive, and most disturbingly, they are intensely personal.